Hi, hello, everyone. Welcome to the AA. You can hear me now, no? More or less. Should I get closer? Yes, my name is Alfredo Ramirez. I program head of landscape urbanism together with Eduardo Rico over here. We just had a MARC final presentation. And we are very happy to welcome Catalina Ortiz for a keynote lecture of the program. We've been discussing within the program, not just in the last hour or hour and a half, ideas about the role of the architecture in contemporary conditions. What are the ways in which designers can actually intervene in urban environments? What are the aspects that we should take into account within the program? We look a lot at policy and how policy actually impact the way in which we operate within the profession. But also we've been looking as well as projects that exist today that are perhaps not necessarily shaped by architects, but have been shaped by struggles or movements or campaigns. And we can actually, or we think we can actually learn from them. And not only that, but also support them. And so within this context, we thought it would be very good to invite Catalina because she has, as she mentioned before, a couple of hats, at least in today's presentation. One is because she's part of the UCL lab, Urban Lab, and also she's part of the World's Corner project, a Latin American market in Seven Sisters, which is representative of those projects that we've been supporting in the program, and it was part of the thesis that was presented today. So the work that Catalina has developed is around this idea of co-production, co-design, and I think it's a good corollary for the year in which we've been thinking about this idea. So Catalina Ortiz is director of UCL Urban Laboratory since June 2024. She joined UCL in 2015 and is professor of critical urban pedagogy in the Bartlett Development Planning Unit. She helped to develop the Global Urbanism Master Program, for which she is teaching contributor and has been a member of Urban Lab's steering committee since 2021. Her work revolves around critical urban pedagogies, planning for equality, and southern urbanisms. As an educator, she is committed to an ethics of care and an engaged scholarship to trigger radical spatial imaginations for a negotiated co-production of space. So please join me to welcome Professor Catalina Ortiz. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's my first time on this side of the room. Usually I'm always in that side of the room. More someone that is always eager to learn about what are the debates and what are the colleagues kind of thinking and doing. As Alfredo mentioned, I'm very passionate about pedagogy, and I think it's in universities and in these spaces where ultimately we have the agency and the power to transform and to push imagination and to kind of have a bit of power in the otherwise very difficult context that we live in. So perhaps just some of you were present in the last presentation. And maybe just to kind of make a bridge of what we were discussing before and what I will be talking about today, and what in a way is behind this title of urban design otherwise, is thinking what if the brief for designers could be designing or helping to develop people's power? What then it changes in us if we think that the brief is that one? And in what way then it helps us to think who can be considered an urban designer, if that would be the remit at the end of the day. So it's in a way that the presentation before and the excellent work that Alfredo and colleagues have been developing in the context of the master program that they steer and direct, helped me to kind of phrase or make this bridge with the work that I myself have been doing. So just to kick us off, usually when we talk about the bio and the professional kind of in a professional sense, there's a lot of that is left out from what people actually are, where they are coming from. And I think that is substantial in the way which we locate ourselves and also how our kind of bodies and identities interpret about the world. And I think something that I'm actually adding lately to my presentations is to say that also I come from the south of Colombia, and I come from a place where is a volcanic area. So my own hometown called Pasto is in the slopes of this volcano called Lucurnina by the indigenous communities there. And I feel that I'm the extension of that territory, and that geographies and those landscapes is the ones that even though I'm no longer there, I'm also there, even inhabiting from a remote place. So I'm simultaneously here, but also there. And I think that, thinking landscapes nowadays and being kind of also inhabitant of this city and of this country, and of being a migrant myself, also changes the ways in which I perceive the institutions where I'm in, and also what is the role that I can play in those spaces. And also for the ones that are not familiar with the flag that is in there is called the Huipala flag. That is a symbol of indigenous struggles and indigenous lands throughout the Americas. Also to say that there's a resistance to also identify ourselves with the notion of the nation state, and therefore I feel more connected to these realities and kind of the power that has been built throughout centuries and that carry through kind of the strength of people also to defend their territories. And it's that with that kind of strength in a way which helped me to be where I am and also to interpret and see the world the way I see it. So it's carrying kind of through those lines, which I think is important as a bit of a context of where I'm speaking from and why do I frame the things I do. So this is the city of Medellín, as a place where I lived for many years and I constantly return to. For many, you would say, but where is the urban design in here, right? And why do we even have to see what is these places, are these places teaching us? Right? But I think if we understand urbanization processes in the world nowadays, we need to acknowledge that the prevalent mode of urbanization is precisely the type of cities that are made by people themselves, self-built neighborhoods, and the so-called informal urbanism is the prevalent mode of urbanization. And therefore, if that is the prevalent mode of urbanization, how can we actually learn for those processes of that people themselves have been building with their own hands, with their own time, with their own labor, and therefore, what are the lessons that we can learn from it? And also challenge kind of the Western paradigms of what urban planning means, who make cities, who are the experts in building cities. And I think those are some of the questions that I've been always kind of carrying with me, and try also to challenge kind of the very canonical perceptions and curriculums that we have when we are engaging particularly with cities and cities of the Global South. And my work has been lately to try to think through the lenses of what would it mean to imagine the constructions of cities through the eyes and through the bodies and through the stories of women such as Mama Chila, that is in there when they have been victims of conflict, and it's been kind of one of the main mechanisms of survival to build from scratch neighborhoods and infrastructures for them to actually inhabit and create shelter in cities. So in the case of Colombia, where I come from, there's no secret that in many of the iterations and processes and ways of urbanization, it's been forced displacement, the main kind of force that have shaped the process of urbanization. And also, the very conditions of conflict have defined that at least, 1 in 5 members of the country, in a way, is a forced displaced person, right? If you think of a country of 50 million, then you could understand the magnitude of what it means to live in cities and how these, in a way, shape a reality that urban planners, urban designers cannot escape and cannot just reproduce the same ways of doing or teaching or engaging or designing these spaces. But also this image comes from one of the historic archives from a specific neighborhood in Medellín that is called COiNVITE, that help us actually to document and see what has been the role of women in building materially the neighborhoods in particularly the city of Medellín. But something that became also very clear in the project that we were discussing earlier on is this notion of COiNVITE, which is how the makeshift infrastructures that are, in a way, these socio-spatial practices of gathering together, doing these makeshift kitchens as part of the sustenance of life, but also as part of gathering together, having collective labor to build collective infrastructures and to produce collectively through the community labor the different spaces in neighborhoods. So this idea of the COiNVITE, in this idea of the COiNVITE or this practice of the COiNVITE, the role of women and cooking and eating and kind of rewarding the collective labor has been essential for survival. And if you see any moment of crisis, such as the pandemic or the national strike, are these community kitchens the ones that have helped to sustain life even in the most complicated circumstances? So I became very obsessed in understanding and learning from this practice to try to see and tease out that if those are the vital infrastructures of care in a way and survival, what can we learn that both from pedagogy, but also in terms of how can we change our conception of urban design in itself? And this is just another image from the archives that help us to see how always collective labor, cooking, and this kind of sharing in the streets, it has been an essential mechanism of city making. So it's with that kind of context in mind that I will be kind of drawing some of my experience of a set of projects in the city of Medellín. And I will be developing or explaining to you kind of what has been, in a way, my strategy and my of analyzing, understanding, but also of engaging with my partners in the four sections. One around shaping common purpose, the second about crafting togetherness, opening alternative narratives and mobilizing impact. Those four sections will be kind of focusing on my work in Colombia. And the last one that I call Fostering People's Power is going to be focusing particularly in a very different project where I have a very different hat, where I no longer consider myself kind of as an urbanist, as a scholar, but rather I would present the work that we've been doing with the CVS in the Seven Sisters Market, more as an inhabitant of London and as part of the community of the Latin American diaspora in London, which then shifts a bit kind of the ground and in a way places me with a different positionality, if you will. So I will start by sharing this idea of how it has been essential to all the work that I have done, this idea of shaping common purpose. And the main mechanism that we have developed with colleagues over time, over the years of collaboration, is trying to develop learning alliances. And this idea of learning alliances go beyond the notion of partnership. In this idea of learning alliance, we are all learning and have a common purpose. And therefore, if you are thinking of a learning alliance where we are all learners, right, all the partners, where we share a common set of curiosity, and part of kind of the purpose is defining what brings us together, what is the common goal that we need each other to develop, that changes not only how we position ourselves in terms of, regardless the asymmetric positions of power, but help us to think differently in terms of a relationship that is not exploitative, but is rather of more collaboration and common and to kind of work together for a common objective. So the first project that I would like to illustrate is the project of COiNVITE, which in a way, I didn't know that the project that Alfredo was directing was material COiNVITE before. So I just realized today how much in common kind of we had with the work that we've been doing. And a key question for this project, that if you see kind of the set of logos at the bottom, would give you a bit of a sense of the very diverse nature of the partnership and the connections that we developed through this project. That in a way was behind this idea of learning from what the city of Medellín has done in order to address in tandem informality and violence, and how the idea of social urbanism became a very paradigmatic way of intervening in informal settlements, and in a way became mainstream and became very important as a currency for urban experts to define and identify kind of a best practice. So I was very kind of unsettled by the idea of this best practice and trying to think that there's one particular way of seeing the transformation of the city, and therefore I wanted to try to find what are the things that haven't been told, what are the stories that the city has accumulated that are not revealed when this the mainstream idea of social urbanism has traveled. So in this project, we started to think about the power of storytelling to try to learn across different contexts and try to define what is a methodology to help us think particularly about neighborhood upgrading and what are the components that are required beyond the usual elements. And in that, in a way, context, we stressed the fact that to understand neighborhood upgrading, we needed to go, connect different strands. And I'm not going to go into the details of each one of the dimensions that you will see there. But I think in this particular project, it was important to bring kind of the whole ecosystem of actors that are shaping the agenda around social and housing justice. And that's why we got different networks, such as the Global Coalition for the Right to the City, UN Habitat, UCLG, that is the Union of Local Governments, but also universities, and at the same time, community organizations that are very grassroots organizations. And it was a very interesting kind of mix, because usually what we tend to be to favor is just to work in participatory processes that have people or peers or people are alike, either communities or experts, but bringing the so-called experts with communities remain a little bit more challenging. So we were kind of thinking of how to push ourselves, how to challenge the common methodologies and try to bring together and define different mechanisms to bring all these different set of stakeholders. Part of the kind of shared common purpose of this other project that in a way came after the COiNVITE project was the idea that what if we think self-built neighborhoods not as a problem to solve, but as a living heritage of the city? And what would it reveal if we are seen through the lenses of living heritage, right? And in that process, what we agree with our partners that were more localized in a specific neighborhood is to try to understand the neighborhood through the lenses of care, recycling, memory, and community communications, right? How people organize and communicate to actually organize and fight for the defense of the territory. And in the third project, the common sense of purpose was to actually identify, if we were already kind of thinking around this idea of living heritage, how to trace then all the knowledge, all the practices, and all the spatial components of the neighborhood. And therefore, we became, we agreed with the partners to think through this idea of the living archive, and also thinking the neighborhood, the partners, and the community leaders and the community organizations as part of the living heritage of the city. But particularly focusing on seeing or understanding or uncovering what is the role that women have had in the defense and the protection of the territory. And in our conversations and negotiations with all the partners, we identified that were kind of key struggles that they wanted us to focus on, right? With a sense of how can we foster intergenerational learning, the notion of having a living archive was becoming even more important, particularly for the more long-term residents and long-term leaders. So the three kind of core themes that we were focusing on was how to deal with the security of tenure, which is kind of one of the most enduring problems when we have to face self-built neighborhoods, and the right to stay put, right? Particularly in a neighborhood that has been facing different waves or threats of eviction in different shapes and forms according to each kind of different administration. The issue around ecological reparation, because the neighborhood we were working in was the former dump of the city, and therefore all the ecological kind of elements and the toxicity of the space and the soil has been also a constant kind of a struggle in terms of defining or using that either as a mechanism or an excuse for eviction, or also as a way to recognize and identify what are the practices of remediation and recycling practices that has been fundamental in the livelihoods of the place. And finally, the topic about the reception of migrants in the context of, as I say, different waves of internal and forced displacement, the notion of welcoming and creating homing mechanisms for migrants that are coming from different places has been and is constantly is one of the challenges and the struggles that the community has to endure. And in terms of crafting togetherness, I think cutting across some of these projects, what has been apparent to me is that thinking design otherwise requires not only to design the output, let's say, or the final spatial footprint of what would it be a spatial transformation or a territorial strategy, but rather I've been focusing more in trying to think how can we be together in order to define not only the common purpose, but also what are the specific mechanisms that you need to use to bring together in the room people that usually are either antagonistic or they don't meet with each other, and that is essential to bring together in order to move kind of agendas that require a good favor housing justice, for instance. And it's in this process where it has been very evident to me that in a way for fostering process of co-creation, it would imply also to create what I have called affective infrastructures, because it's not only a functional thing to do, but also because you need to develop, in a way, in a sense, empathy and some sort of affective bonding in order for a co-creation process to be meaningful, in a way, developing the sense of care and mutual responsibility for each other. In the project of the COiNVITE, this is part of what we kind of did with this very different set of actors coming from multilateral agencies all the way to community leaders. And something that we learn from the COiNVITE is that food never fails in bringing people together. So instead of starting with a gathering to tell everyone what do they do or what do they think about this project and neighborhood upgrading and what each organization is doing about it, what we did is starting cooking together and bringing people from all these different groups in sub-teams to cook together. So the director of UN Habitat, instead of being the director of UN Habitat, was the one that needed to be cutting the food. The community leader in that case was the one that was actually doing the cooking, and then the academic was the one that putting it in the plate, right? According to each team, everyone changed the role. And by doing and exposing to other ways of doing and being together, it generated immediately a different type of team dynamics and kind of challenging the usual kind of roles that someone would perform according to their level of expertise or power. And because food never fails, that is the best way also to create those more spaces of conviviality that are the precondition to actually do a more kind of co-creative process. But also crafting togetherness, from the pandemic, we learned that there's possibilities to also do it not only in the flesh, with the beauties of the food, but also when we are remotely working, it seemed an impossible situation at the moment. However, part of the community leaders that we were working with, and in this case, we were working with students from across the globe, community leaders and local students in the city of Medellín. One of the community leaders said, here we are all equal because we are all sharing the same space in the screen. And that was a very interesting point that he raised, because there was another sense of equality that was brought in this very difficult and complicated digital space. And that helped us to think with our students in that it was created a new affective cartography. And no matter what, even if we are apart, we always try to find ways of connecting. And that I found very beautiful, the way in which students represented this way of connecting even to remoteness. And part of that discussion in terms of how can we also come together is in terms of understanding how can even actually we talk together about things. And part of the debates and the discussions we had with our partners is that we also, so many times we take for granted the very vocabularies that we use to engage with each other. And part of what the things that our community partners felt that was very oppressive in a way, and in a way, a strategy to exert epistemic violence, was that usually the urban experts would come with a jargon or with terms that would further amplify the territorial stigma about the places where they inhabit, right? So the discourse itself and the vocabularies were also a terrain where us as designers needed to think through then how can to even create a vocabulary that could actually support us to negotiate, to create kind of common paths for a shared understanding of a reality in order to intervene it, but also further try to think in how to transform it. And we developed, and I'm not thinking that you read the whole detail, but it was very interesting to actually focus on the discursive element to define what would be then a reparative glossary. And that as part of our iteration, as our journey of co-creation, right? With community leaders, we started analyzing what were the specific terms that they felt they were pejorative, that they thought that were the tools also for promoting interventions or policies or spatial narratives that were kind of used as a linchpin for justifying eviction. And in a way, we created this reparative glossary as part of how can we start bridging some conversations with the local authorities. And another way we define also in the moment of during the pandemic is that we also can create ways of being together, even staying apart, and also trying to bring to, as part of the co-process of the co-design process, the generation of songs and common sounds as part of this process.
Mi tierra llevo dentro, fruto de mis ancestros, un sueño que a lo lejos exige dignidad. Mi corazón se estremece con cada recuerdo donde crecí, en ese lugar que descalzo en tus calles de historias te recorrí. Ahí estás tú, pintada de color, sin temor de luchar por tu amor. Eres aire y eres fuego, entre luz y oscuridad, la razón de mis desvelos. Mi tierra llevo dentro, fruto de mis ancestros.
y habitando un nuevo mundo, arrastrando el baúl de los recuerdos vividos, que el desarrollo no arrolle con todo lo que he construido. Un pueblo que no se vence, resistiendo a cada paso, con un sueño latente que revive en cada ocaso. Y me pregunto si tú, sentado en tu sillón, acaso comprende las historias que hoy quieres borrar con trazos.
Y yo te vengo a cantar para agradecer la vida, endulzala un poco más. Verás cómo es de bonita, los miedos ya no tendrán lugar. Vamos todos juntos a luchar.
Eres aire y eres fuego, entre luz y oscuridad, la razón de mis desvelos. Eres mi guerra y mi paz. Mi tierra llevo dentro, fruto de mis ancestros, un sueño que a lo lejos exige dignidad. Mi tierra llevo dentro, fruto de mis ancestros, un sueño que a lo lejos exige dignidad. A la 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 yeah, 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 a la 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 yeah.
And you could say, but what does it have to do a song with a design process, right? We were bringing together communities, cultural producers that were working with us in this process. And I think it became very apparent that in order to bring people together and create different narratives of a place, actually doing a song was a perfect vehicle to actually discover and uncover other talents of the people, the students and the partners in a moment where there was a lot of, pain, and just also trying to craft the spaces for another kind of creative strand and kind of generating joy was a very catalytic moment to actually help us engage in different kind of registers of this co-creation process. And as part of learning also from the very spatial practices, and you saw partly in the video kind of the use of these small carts that are very essential for street vending in most of the cities of the global majority, we also were learning from these kind of microarchitectures. And part of the strategies of coming together was devising these little artifacts to actually bring the project to the streets and actually using this device to not only disseminate the things and the findings and the generation of ideas and provocations of the project, but also using the very machines or little architecture of these artifacts as a trigger mechanism for bringing together people and actually being used by our partners and other people in the neighborhood for whatever activity they were doing. So it has become a very kind of useful set of micro architecture artifacts for bringing people together. And I think a part of this process also help us to think that how learning and how the urban knowledge of those people that inhabit and have built the neighborhood has been very essential for us, and something that we did as part of thinking the project, particularly of the Living Archive, is understanding what are the stories that you can tell about the different struggles through the lenses of what are the routes, what are the stops, and what are the people that you need to be talking to in those spaces. So for us, part of that process was also thinking in what are kind of the trajectories that you need to take in the space in order to understand a particular set of stories, practices, and struggles in that place. And as part of that process with our students, we engage in kind of intervention in very particular strategic spaces of the very, and the tensions around public spaces, particularly in areas where there's constantly, the upcoming set of migrants that would like to occupy and use the space, but also a constant struggle to preserve those spaces for having spaces for play and also for public use. And I think just the mundane elements of walking around and walking as an essential way to engage with the place has been, of course, very important for us. And also part of this strategy and idea of how can we understand and see the space otherwise, particularly in places that, as I said, has been built and inhabited by people that have endured very important geotrauma, is the very important role that emotions play in understanding a space. So part of the discussions with our community partners was precisely how to actually methodologically address this idea of mapping emotions as a very important kind of input in understanding how then the design of the strategies of transformation of the neighborhood need to take into consideration what are kind of these emotional landscapes that this place has. And we had a lot of hours of interaction with our partners to actually design what type of emotions matter in the space, what would be meaningful and productive for our purposes of designing an alternative way of understanding the neighborhood. And importantly, the colors that would be used in that process. And it was very interesting that how, for instance, if you see the purple color, is the emotion that they call care. And it became very apparent that care was part of the key vocabulary that community leaders were using in order to understand what are the spaces of hope, but also the spaces of the infrastructures that they've been building and preserving throughout decades. And also the other emotions that are more associated to pain and sadness, and equally joy, calm, and hope. So it was a very interesting kind of the tapestry of emotions that was revealed based on how we use these kind of color codes in this mosaic or this map of the neighborhood with different people, passersby, and community members that kind of support us in this process. And somehow that also helped us to connect with some of the key methodologies that is coming from feminist indigenous groups, that is this idea of mapping body territory. That is a very kind of a methodology that has gained a lot of traction in the Latin American region, particularly associated to trace socio-environmental problems. And I think for us, it was very, we tried to come to this very in a subtle way and very carefully kind of crafting and the ethics of how this would become a productive moment of understanding also how we kind of challenge ideas of Western ideas that see in a dichotomy the body and the space, and how, particularly in more indigenous ways of knowing, there's no separation between body, territory, and earth. And I think we wanted to bring those discussions that have been, circulating and are very close, particularly to places that are very, very connected with violence, but also with environmental degradation. And this methodology for us became very important to see and to try to kind of define how, how particularly the body kind of suffers and endures the pain, and how also the body kind of connects with the different places of the neighborhood. So in this case, because of a lot of kind of traumatic history of the neighborhood, one of kind of a common thread that we identified is that to be a woman in Moravia hurts. And we couldn't just, we needed to transform the perspective of how to see a space when you are told multiple stories of some places that have, deep memories of harm and violence that you cannot treat as if they were any other common space that are not so loaded emotionally. And I think that helped us to think differently about not only how do we relate with the people that inhabit the space, but also as how we see and treat and understand also the spatiality of it. And as part of this idea of foregrounding the role of women in the neighborhood, we created a small kind of ceremony where we were kind of actually offering pictures to the women that for different generations has been in the neighborhood and have contributed to support all the infrastructures that in a way provide and have sustained life in the neighborhood. And all through these to kind of bring this idea that also design is a way to opening alternative narratives of a place, particularly when in the work that I've been doing that has been focusing in trying to think how to change the territorial stigma of places. And narrative plays a central role in how can we start shifting those narratives. So for us was very important to bring different kind of methodologies of bringing kind of visual storytelling, particularly with community leaders from different neighborhoods, to try to understand from the perspective of the people that come from forced displacement to a place or to a neighborhood, and what is the process, and also what are the values and what matters in these spaces. And of course, if you see on the side the pot, the general, there's a recurrent theme of bringing together around the food and around the meal as a symbol also of community solidarity. And also that we kind of were thinking in this project of the COiNVITE was to problematize the use of kind of the jargon that urbanists use, and try to use other means to understand or try to see what people understand from those common vocabularies that we tend to assume everyone understands. So we engage with the idea of doing pictograms of the different kind of keywords to actually open up discussions about what can it be then a common understanding of those kind of key vocabularies. And somehow what we, in a way, we were triggering as a format for exchanging and having a productive discussion around problematizing the notion of best practice and the idea that a lot of people are very eager to get what is the recipe for fixing the problems of a city, and instead trying to think about the use of a recipe, but to problematize the notion of best practice. And the question we use particularly in this exercise is what is missing in that recipe that has been circulating around in terms of the intervention of the transformation of Medellín, or if the recipe is the social urbanism, what would you add to that recipe, or what would be your recipe or your alternative recipe? So we were playing with the words, but also with the format, because the recipe was a format that everyone can relate to. And in a way, we trigger very interesting conversation with these groups that were coming from different stakeholders. But also as part of that process, we developed this immersive platform of transmedia storytelling, where after all the discussions and the definition collectively of what would be the key stories that would help us learn about neighborhood upgrading, then we develop this immersive landscape, bringing a little bit the images of real neighborhoods, but also kind of bringing fiction to depict a very kind of more uplifting version of these landscapes, and trying to show also another visual imaginary of how to interpret what would it be if we see these places in reality as this living heritage of the place, and we kind of highlight kind of the assets and the very interesting practices to preserve and protect life that are kind of already happening in the place. And I think I'm a bit, I have 10 minutes left or something like that. I tend to talk a lot, and I'm always like halfway through. So I'm just going to skip through quickly, and I'll go and I'll try to devote few minutes to the project here in London. And here, I think just to say that something that we started discussing this few years ago, and now that is becoming very mainstream, the notion of care, we here I started to discuss the notion of care through the lenses of, what are the stories of women that have been developing and engaging with sustaining life, but also trying to see how care manifests and territorializes, and what are the specific practices, both in the micro and in the meso level, that are actually what we could catalog as practices of care. So just trying to trace care as a territorial circuit was something that we were very keen to do, and trying to understand, and test how that would look like and what would it mean if that is kind of the asset you get in order to define the strategies of intervention. And of course, that help us to think and define with the community members and the rest of the partners what would be the key spaces that have the more potential to mobilize people, particularly identifying the places that are more relevant socially and politically for the community. And in the last project that we did, in a way, something that it was also kind of a prerequisite for our partners was that we also leave a physical material trace of the exchange and the co-creation processes that we did. And this is a mural that was done just kind of in the entrance of the neighborhood. That is a visual summary of the project, where in conjunction with an artist that has been working with this community for many years, after we did kind of the project, he and in discussion with our partners designed this mural, and now is, the community leaders is one of the first stops where everyone entering at the neighborhood sees, and in a way is an homage to the role of women building and sustaining literally the neighborhood. And this has been something that people feel very proud about it. And I think we were very happy that at least after many of these projects, there's also a testimony, a visual testimony of part of the work that we've been doing together. So in terms of mobilizing impact, even though part of the COiNVITE project intended to do a transmedia platform, that became just only an output, but what in reality it became very important and interesting for us was actually creating and thinking in what was the strategy for bringing people together. And this toolkit that emerged from it help us to kind of think in a broader question that was how to use storytelling for urban learning. And that urban learning not only understood through the lenses of the pedagogy that we use in universities, but more posing the question of this kind of critical urban pedagogy that brings together different actors across the city, and how it was vital for us to partner with not necessarily the usual suspects and bring particularly community radios as one of the key partners to amplify and to disseminate kind of the work that we've been doing that usually is very hard kind of to make circulate in other circuits of knowledge, if you will. But also this work led us to have, let's say, a broader political impact, because we were already working with, let's say, the networks of networks, on the one hand, kind of the more multilateral agencies, but also global networks of advocacy for the right to the city. This helped us to actually go all the way to define an impact more on the policy side, to bring and create together this kind of common decalogue for participatory neighborhood upgrading that was adopted by all the ministers of housing and territorial development at the level of Latin America and the Caribbean. And you could see there now some of the kind of key movers and shakers of the more in the multilateral sense, because we kind of help to devise and to convene this network and this alliance to actually help and intervene in also how we refer and what is kind of the agenda in that front. But also I think in terms of design, sometimes we forget that it's also about how can we design this distributed public engagement and use kind of all the ecosystem, both in person and digital, of community media, urban journalism, and the collaborative platforms as well to circulate kind of part of the work that we have done. So I'm going to move, and perhaps just to conclude that phase of the work that we've been doing in Medellín. Some also of the most kind of rewarding parts of these processes is that people have organized themselves, and as part of particularly the project of the Living Archive, they have created a collective that in a way are meeting every month by themselves to actually have an impact in the spatial plan, the upgrade of the spatial plan of the city, and also as a way to kind of, they have certified to be the living heritage of the neighborhood. So even though our kind of engagement has been more at the distance now lately, the process carry on, and they kind of self-organize and keep kind of, in a way, the seed that we started planting and mobilizing kind of lives through this collective. And also at the bottom, you could see the last meeting that happened just right in December with the local authorities, where all kind of the still knowledge and proposals that we've been working on, that was in a way passed as part of the process of upgrading the spatial plan of the city. So in a way, all this work has a policy kind of component that is always trying to think and influence and using any political window of political opportunity to actually use what we are doing to influence there. So I think we are short on time. I don't know, Alfredo, if I can skim quickly through this part that is around, like just how that then, in a way, when we kind of go at least more to the work that I've been doing in London, not in the capacity of a researcher, but as I was saying at the beginning, more in my capacity of a city dweller and as part of the Latin American diaspora in London, I found that knowledge that I've been creating and kind of that sensibility of place and co-creation could be useful in the context of a very particular space and tangible space where I can feel more useful now that I'm kind of working more time here in London. And for you and for the ones of you that are not familiar with, this is the corner of Ward's Corner in Seven Sisters. And I really like that image because in reality, it captures a little bit of all kind of the urban life and kind of a very small reproduction of the type of neighborhoods that I was speaking about in the very center of the heart of London. And I think that is a very interesting kind of connection that I found in a way motivating for me to engage with this project. And just for giving a bit of context, it's important to say that the Latin American community is one of the fastest growing groups in the UK, and therefore the recognition of us in this space is something very important, and kind of that is a bit of the background and the backdrop of the relevance of this project. And the space of the market has been, in a way, a little microcosms to preserve and to have a space that has a vital migrant infrastructure that is not only a market, but is a home, is a space for refuge, and a space that was serving a very vital role for supporting migrants in these different waves of migration to actually to help navigate the realities of actually arriving in London. And I think when you are someone coming from other place, you always try to find what is familiar, where you can find support in a rather hostile environment, particularly for migration. That becomes even more relevant. However, of course, I don't have time to go about all the context where this is inserted in terms of all the kind of political history of Tottenham and all the kind of the very important role that has played in the political landscape of the city. But also just to highlight that it's been a fight and a struggle of over 20 years of the communities and the traders that have been in the market, and therefore, after a very kind of long history of community resistance, somehow now we are in a very important moment. This image just helps you to see, a vignette of what the space of the Market of Seven Sisters was, and how relevant and vibrant it was for the Latin American community in particular. And how these type of spaces that through the lenses, if you see it through the lenses of living heritage, would have a very different interpretation as if you see it through the lenses of the traditional canonical way that you would say, and one of the reasons why it has been completely demolished, all this interior of the market, is because it was seen as a favela, and I quote, this is the name that the designer that presented the project said, because it looked like a favela, therefore it was a risk to health and safety, and therefore it needed to be removed, right? This is the type of, the not only epistemological violence, but also racism that is reproducing the institutions that deal also with infrastructures that are supposed to be emblematic and very relevant to sustain life for migrant communities in the city. And this was, here you can see the contrast between what the Latin Village initial idea was on this side, but also what was the idea or the proposal by the developer that was presented, right? To this generic kind of redevelopment, through the usual kind of big chains, the Tesco's and the Costas, versus what we had before in terms of a space where you could find empanadas and you can find coffee and you can find things that not only in terms of the products, but also of the spaces that are vital for actually creating and protecting community. In response to that idea of regeneration, there was a big campaign that was fought in many fronts, and in a way, that combination of strategies of resistance and organization is what have made this project to be very emblematic, because of the kind of political resonance that it had, but also of the sense of urgency as well, to try to find different mechanisms to protect this vital infrastructure. And this fight has been fought in many fronts, from the United Nations to the local politics of the mayor, but also how even the collective of women and dancing also as a strategy of resistance have been playing an important part of this kind of different mosaic of strategies of resistance to actually come to, let's say, a very big win and victory when the developer proposal has been kind of taken out of the table, and now the community plan, and particularly the creation of the Wars Corner Community Benefit Society, have brought to become one of the big partners now with Places for London and the community and the council to actually be the plan that needs to be developed. So defeating the developer in this case has been a major victory, and it's have taken the alliance and a political campaign that moved many kind of groups around the city and not beyond the vicinity of the market. And I think thinking design otherwise through the lenses of what it means be a community-led development, it entails a bigger political strategy, and something that is completely essential for thinking design otherwise. If, going back to my initial idea, if the brief is to create collective people's power, then what is then the role of the designer, and what is actually the material that the designer needs to take into account? Of course, during the pandemic, and with the excuse that to be a problem of risk and safety, all the interior of the building has been demolished, and it has been completely kind of covered for over 5 years. And this, in a way, became as part of the big fight, something that has been achieved through the mobilization of people, and particularly of the persistence of the traders, that they have put in risk all their livelihoods, is that, there was the agreement to do at least a temporary market. And in parallel, there has been a complete kind of change of the political moment in the council, where 10 years ago, the recognition of Latin American communities in Haringey was denied, to 10 years after, a few months ago, to be recognized as one of the ethnicities that actually exist in the borough. And I think those are kind of sending signals of a change of political climate, at least, and the favorability, at least for the project. And just recently, a few months ago, the temporary market has been open and has been a very successful space, particularly when it's sunny. And I invite you to go there. Now, as the community, as the CVS, we have managed to secure the community room. So it's a space that we're running as an anchor point to actually connect with different organizations, social organizations and services for migrant communities in the area and beyond, but also has in a way, recover partly all the sense of vibrancy and community life that it used to hold. And it has been also the space for celebrating the Latin American culture and to keep us always in line and in mind that, you know, what is at the stake there is a bigger political project, not only the preservation of the building in itself, but the idea that a different city is possible and that community ownership and community-led projects are feasible even and despite kind of the big forces that are against it. So just to conclude, and very quickly because I'm way over time now, after all these, in a way, I wanted to arrive to some sort of, 10 points that for me has become a bit of the, my manifesto or some of the lessons that I have learned through working on all these kind of different fronts. And for me, an urban design otherwise requires or implies unlearning the Eurocentric canons on the production of space and the embedded white supremacy that those entail. And urban design otherwise aims at achieving spatial justice in tandem with epistemic and racial justice. And we cannot talk about the spatial justice if it's not in conjunction with these other, let's say, dimensions. It needs to be politically relevant and committed to establishing an equitable spatial planning system. It needs to promote a pluriversal spatial imaginations. It needs to emphasize a sensing, thinking, ethic of care and empathy in the learning process. And hence, things like emotions are not something that are peripheral, but also central to that type of sensibility to understand particular conditions and communities. That defy kind of the general kind of Western white canon, connect with multi-scalar and translocal perspectives of body territory, promote intra and transdisciplinary approaches, support counter-hegemonic territorial practices, and in these days that anti, it seems to be needed to be very explicit, and explore diverse and creative methodologies to unveil relational ontologies, right? Not the usual only methodologies that we have had to engage with the space. And finally, assume strategies of co-production of territorial knowledge with affection, joy, and beauty. And if it's not in those terms, I'm not interested in any other type of urban design. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Does it work? I think so, yeah. And for the presentation and for sharing, obviously, your experience, your knowledge, and the pedagogy that you are using. I think, it's kind of refreshing to see a completely different approach, especially, in the context in which we are. I'm talking about the AA, where sometimes some of these aspects are perhaps peripheral, to the way in which we approach, and to see that perhaps some of them can actually be central, to understanding the way one can operate as designers of an architect is something that I guess we have to learn, or as you said, to unlearn, from that. Just to start, obviously this is we have some few minutes for questions from the public, but I just want to know whether if you have seen or if you have sensed, at least from your experience as a teacher, whether these methodologies or these ideas have been spreading from your students to the way they practice, or how do you think they're taking those knowledges or experiences back into the way they operate? Because I'm asking this because a lot of the time happens that what you teaches in the school then obviously gets confronted to the, let's say, reality of the system in which we live, like you end up working for a corporate office, or you need to then dealing with, a private client that you have to So how these strategies you think are or have been shaping the practice of your students, or how you see that change happening?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. What I always have the hope is that, you carry the change you want to see in the world. And I think, some of the, if we can call it impact, is that at least the organizations that we've been working with, even the mainstream ones, have brought together or used some of the methodologies that we have designed. The storytelling in particular has been very appealing for some of the organizations, particularly working with migrants and housing and migration. Some of my colleagues have used some of these methodologies, so I think this kind of creating some different waves, but also always track when and who is, I think, very difficult. But I think some of the colleagues that I work with in different parts of the world, at least I have reports that they kind of do and kind of use part of this. But also I didn't present here some other projects with colleagues in another city in Colombia, where we've been doing a more concerted effort to work with the municipality. And it's in the context of the city of Cali, and one of the projects we did, and that is now called the Populab, where some of the work that we've been doing has been also translated and have, ended up converted in specific public spaces. So we develop a methodology to bring an intersectional perspective to the design of public spaces in informal settlements, kind of with all these contexts, and it's kind of through those kind of using and adapting and negotiating some of these methodologies that I think that has found, a very concrete land. But also we've been working very hard in the context of more the public policy, and particularly in the context of Colombia with this, let's say, this political window of political opportunity in the last years. We managed to, to push or be part of the group to advocate for a policy called Neighbourhoods of Peace. And it's in the context of kind of thinking neighborhood upgrading as a strategy of territorial reparation, which I think we've been managing to channel some of these lessons learned and these ways of doing, that with many colleagues that are kind of thinking about what is the spatial expression of reparative justice. We've been kind of finding ways to kind of percolate those spaces. And the practice that has been set up with some of my students themselves are also testing and shifting and doing perhaps not exactly this, but completely different things according to kind of the different kind of spaces and opportunities and interests that they have had. But I cannot tell you exactly each one of them.
I don't know if anyone has a question or a comment.
Gina.
Catalina, thank you so much for the amazing presentation. I was Catalina's student at the GPU and took part in Moravia's project. Catalina, I have a question for you about the Seven Sisters Market project. We've seen, you've presented the political and policy background of it. I would like to know more about the design process and what were some of the tools that you developed with the community to get the market again up and running in terms of the spaces, the stalls, the requirements. How did you, what was the participatory element to it? Thank you.
Well, I was, prefacing the story of the market, saying, in that case, I'm more like I play a different role, and the process of the design of the temporary market was a very contentious one, where the traders didn't have a direct say on it, right? So it's been a constant struggle to actually generate the idea of parity and the need of having, if you are in a community-led project or an aspiration to have a community-led project, it has been one of the fronts of a struggle to make places for London to understand that everyone should have an input in a space that is actually going to be inhabited by the traders. So I was not part of the CVS at the moment that the design of the temporary market was made. But now we are in this new phase, and part of the thing that we are, in a way, negotiating is that the following phase, which is kind of taking over the big building, the main building, that we actually have a say. And if you, in the presentation that precedes us, that is the presentation of the students, of Alfredo's students, they were precisely showing some of the ideas to actually steer the collaborative design and the phase approach and the incremental design for transforming and retrofitting the building. So this is something that is yet to happen. But what the work that we've been doing for a year and a half is actually getting organized as CBS and trying to negotiate, just open the space, make the best out of it, mobilize the tripartite agreement with the council, with places, try to make the community space work. So we are not even there yet. And I think that is the next phase for us to do. But we are early in the process to actually design phase. And I think one of the biggest discussions is, to challenge the idea that the design needs to be with some expert there and that there want to be no input, neither from the CVS and the membership of the CVS. So that agreement and that negotiation is very soon to happen. And I think that is going to be our next challenge. But we are running up against a lot of preconceptions and a lot of, ideas that, they are not very used to see or to think with communities, but just from a very unilateral perspective, that is something that an expert do, and people is just a passive user of a space. And I think that is kind of the biggest kind of challenge that we are bringing, and we hope to use some of these tools as part of it. And if you're interested, we just saw this idea of the design of this collaborative retrofitting of the project. So we hope, to unleash. But the political times, as you know, are not the times, it's a long-term fight. So that's why I think we've been working more in the political kind of arrangements that need to be, and the capacity of a voluntary run organization and all the challenges that it has.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm very impressed with your work. I think it is very thorough. It's very qualitative. It's very sensitive as well, using all the senses, using different ways of expression, visual and verbal and the rest of it. And I think this is very good, because usually we end up with statistics and numbers and things like that. And I think it is very refreshing that this is what you're focusing on. Now, I don't really know very much about the Latin American situation and so on, but what occurred to me when I listened to you, said you have a methodology which you use there, and then there were some how you can help minority communities in Latin America, say, for example, to be able to live their own life in relation to their own culture, minority culture, whatever, and then to say, how can you transpose that in a very different situation like London, which is in the culture, the general country is not Latin American, it's English, it's European and so on. And the Latin American groups are living communities in quite fragmented and so on. And the last one, which still has a market, is that one in Harrogate, you're saying. So my question is, what happens to the others? For example, in Elephant Castle, I mean, they were quite a strong Latin American community. I mean, we went to their market and so forth and so on. And they seem to be in a very precarious situation. So what happens when they still have a market in Harrogate, so they can try to hold on to that? which is a kind of focus for them. So what happens to the others? Are they really being completely pushed out, or what can be done with your methodology? That's what I would like to know.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm also the trustee of Latin Elephant, so I have many hats here. It's true. Just to bring an anecdote, the day that we were having the big opening, with David Lammy and all the rest of it, that very day, our friends in Elephant and Castle were being evicted, right? Some of the traders that were relocated were being evicted. So there has been, in a way, the example of Elephant and Castle is, an example where the developers won. And as you said, they are in very precarious conditions, because when you fragment people and you push them into the limits, it's very hard to survive, right? So what Latin Elephant, the charity Latin Elephant has created or is joining is an alliance with the other communities that are kind of fighting for the right to stay put. And that's why I say, this is a long-term fight, and it's a matter of also organizing, getting together. But in the case of, like the proximity, being in zone 1, tells the story of like how brutal the forces are to basically price out people. And we have here someone that did the dissertation on an elephant that perhaps can say something else. But I support the organization that is kind of working and trying to help and advocate and channel legal support to the traders that have been priced out, and try to negotiate like a resettlement scheme, or try to find different alternatives. But it's a very, very complicated, convoluted case, and clearly we are not winning there, sadly. You want to say something? No? Okay. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Anyone else who wants to ask?
We can go and have drinks.
Okay.
So it's Friday night, right? So it's time to rest.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Catalina, and everyone for attending the lecture. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.